We want to know, would you welcome them back? Do you think the royals need them? Nina, where do you stand on this? Are you excited about their Australia trip?
Well, I watch them and just see what warmth they have and how crowds react to them. It's very natural. And you see the relationship between the two of them. It's obviously fantastically affectionate, which is not the sort of stuffed shirt approach that we have here. And the royals do need them. The royals needed them and they pushed them out. They didn't leave voluntarily, they were pushed out. And they do need them. If you look at, in terms of the practical issues, Charles is 77 and has cancer. Camilla is slightly older than him. Well, there's William and Kate. Princess Anne is one. She should have been queen, actually, frankly, I think. Princess Anne is a complete stalwart, but she cannot go on forever. And then after that, who? There's Edward. You know, he's got as much charisma as a plank. And there's, well, let's not mention Andrew. And the younger, where are the younger ones? There are no, you know, they're not going to be Andrew's daughters.
Well, you've still got George and Charlotte and Louis.
Yeah, but they're not there yet. They're not there. It's going to be an enormous gap. In about 5 years' time, there's going to be an enormous gap. I think that Harry and Meghan were much maligned. The press and the palace combined together to set the public up against them, to make William and Kate look better, and because there was too much glory going on to them. Do you remember the actual joy after that wedding, where everybody loved them? And that couldn't be allowed to continue because the royal line of succession must continue. The big machine, the big carriage has to go on.
Would it be fair to say, though, Nina, that Meghan she's not from Britain, first of all, so she's got a completely different attitude to certain things, being from America, and she's probably not naturally a royal personality, and maybe Harry isn't either, and so maybe that annoyed the papers, that they weren't abiding by the royal rules, like giving certain papers the first picture of their children, like coming out from the hospital moments after giving birth. They decided to take a different route, and let's face it, that annoyed some people in Britain.
It does, because she didn't conform to the say nothing, sweet English rose, you know, say nothing, look fabulous, wear a lovely frock. You know, I can't imagine that Harry and Meghan would give up their life in California. Why should they? They have a very, very good life. But they can do an enormous amount of good. That because, you know, look at Harry's Invictus Games. Look at the, you know, and actually it's always blame the woman, isn't it? So Meghan Meghan has copped it from the start, and I think she has a genuine connection with women and with people, and she's a very smart woman. And you know, you were talking about how they spilled all the royal secrets. That there are plenty of royal secrets to come out, believe me, which they didn't spill. But Diana had her book. Charles had his book with Jonathan.
So you've just watched that clip, and let's be honest for a second. That was not the kind of conversation the UK media usually allows to breathe. That wasn't the usual polite nodding along to tired talking points. That was someone stepping right into the middle of the narrative and quietly flipping the entire thing over without raising her voice. Because what you just heard wasn't outrage. It wasn't even defensive. It was calm, observational, and honestly, a little too honest for comfort. And that's exactly why it hits so hard. For years now, the public has been fed this carefully curated story about Harry and Meghan, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. A story where they are painted as difficult, disruptive, ungrateful, and somehow both irrelevant and dangerously influential at the same time, which is quite the contradiction if you actually think about it for more than 5 seconds. But what Nina did in that moment was strip all of that noise away and bring the focus back to something very simple: what people actually see with their own eyes. Warmth, connection, authenticity. Those aren't things you can manufacture through press briefings or palace statements. You can't brief chemistry into existence. And yet every time Harry and Meghan step out in public, that's the one thing that consistently cuts through everything else. You see it in how they interact with each other, how they engage with crowds, how people respond to them. It's not stiff, it's not rehearsed, it's human. And that, ironically, is what made them such a problem. Because the system they stepped into was never designed for that kind of energy. It's built on hierarchy, on order, on a very specific way of doing things. There are expectations, traditions, unspoken rules that have been passed down for generations. And within that structure, individuality is tolerated only to a point. You can shine, but not too brightly. You can connect, but not so much that you overshadow the institution itself. And that's where things started to shift. Nina touched on something that people don't like to say out loud, but it's been sitting there in plain sight for years. There was a moment, especially around their wedding, where the energy around Harry and Meghan was undeniable. It wasn't just media hype, it was global excitement. People felt something. There was joy, there was curiosity, there was hope that maybe things were changing. And that level of attention, that level of affection, it didn't just exist in a vacuum. It had implications. Because when one part of an institution suddenly becomes the focal point of global attention, it creates imbalance. And institutions like that are built to resist imbalance. They don't adapt quickly. They correct. They stabilize. They bring things back into line. So when Nina says they were pushed, she's not speaking emotionally. She's describing a process, a slow, steady shift in tone, a change in coverage, stories that start off neutral, then become critical, then relentless. Small things becoming big issues, personal choices framed as defiance, boundaries framed as disrespect. And before you know it, the narrative has changed completely. What's fascinating is how quickly that transformation happened. One minute, they were being celebrated. The next, every move was being dissected, questioned, criticized. And not just criticized, but interpreted through the worst possible lens. Intentions were assigned, motives were speculated on, and the public, whether consciously or not, was being guided toward a particular conclusion. That doesn't happen by accident. And then there's the question Nina raised that really lingers. If they were so unnecessary, so problematic, so irrelevant, why does the conversation keep circling back to them? Why is there still this level of focus, this level of scrutiny, this level of emotional investment from people who claim they've moved on? Because the truth is, whether people want to admit it or not, they filled a space that hasn't really been replaced. When you look at the current landscape, there's an obvious gap forming. You have senior figures carrying a heavy load, dealing with personal and public pressures. You have younger members who are not yet in a position to take on that responsibility. And in between, there's a stretch of time where the demands of the role don't decrease, but the number of people able to meet them does. That's not criticism, that's just reality. And within that reality, Harry and Meghan represented something valuable, not just in terms of numbers or appearances, but in terms of energy. They brought a different approach, a different tone, a different way of engaging with people that felt more in tune with the modern world. They weren't trying to erase tradition, but they also weren't willing to be completely defined by it. And that tension, that balance between honoring the past and stepping into the present is not something every institution handles well. Storm's point about Meghan not being naturally royal is one we've heard before, just dressed up in slightly different language each time. It sounds polite, it sounds reasonable, but when you really break it down, what does it actually mean? It means she didn't fit into a pre-existing mold. She didn't follow the expected script. She didn't adopt the say nothing, smile, and carry on approach that has been the standard for so long. And instead of asking whether that standard might need updating, the response was to question her for not conforming to it. But here's the thing. The world has changed. People don't connect with perfection anymore. They connect with honesty. They connect with vulnerability. They connect with people who seem real, who speak, who react, who show emotion. And Meghan brought that with her, not as an act, but as part of who she is. And for a lot of people, especially women, that resonated. Nina's point about blame the woman wasn't just a throwaway comment. It was an observation rooted in a pattern that has repeated itself over and over again. When something disrupts the status quo, when something challenges expectations, there's often a tendency to focus on the woman in the situation, to scrutinize her more closely, to assign responsibility more quickly. And in this case, that scrutiny was intense. Every choice, every gesture, every word was analyzed in a way that went far beyond normal public interest. It became personal. And once it becomes personal, it's very hard to pull it back into the realm of fairness. At the same time, Harry's role in all of this was framed in ways that shifted depending on the narrative of the day. Sometimes he was portrayed as someone who had changed, who had stepped away from expectations. Other times, he was depicted as someone being influenced, guided, even controlled. But rarely was he treated as an adult capable of making his own decisions. And that's an interesting contradiction because it removes agency from him while placing responsibility on her. It creates a dynamic where one is seen as passive and the other as active, regardless of the reality. What Nina did, in a very understated way, was challenge that entire framework. She brought the focus back to what's actually visible, the connection between them, the way they interact, the way people respond. And she asked, without explicitly asking, why that has been turned into something negative. Because when you strip everything else away, what's left is pretty straightforward. Two people who chose a different path. Two people who decided that the way things had always been done didn't necessarily have to dictate the way they lived their lives. And that decision, more than anything else, is what sparked the reaction we've been watching unfold. Not because it was unprecedented, but because it was public. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't quietly managed behind the scenes, it was visible. And visibility changes everything. It forces conversations, it exposes contradictions, it highlights the gap between what is presented and what is experienced. And that's where things become uncomfortable. Because once people start to see that gap, they start to question it. They start to look more closely. They ask whether the narrative they've been given matches the reality in front of them. And sometimes it doesn't. That's why moments like this matter. Not because they're loud or dramatic, but because they're clear. They cut through the noise. They offer a different perspective without trying to force it. And in doing so, they create space for people to think for themselves. And maybe that's the part that's most unsettling for those who prefer a more controlled narrative. Because once that space exists, it's very hard to close it again. People remember what they've seen. They remember how something made them feel, and no amount of headlines or commentary can completely erase that. And now here's the part that really sends certain corners of the media into a quiet panic spiral: the Australia visit. Because for all the noise, all the predictions, all the dramatic headlines trying to downplay it before it even began, day one already told a completely different story. The energy on the ground did not match the gloomy expectations that were being pushed. People showed up, people engaged, and most importantly, people responded. Not out of obligation, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to be there. And that kind of reception, especially on day one, sets the tone for everything that follows. You can try to spin it later, you can try to reframe it, but you cannot undo genuine public reaction once it's happened in real time. What makes this visit feel life-changing isn't just the optics, it's what it represents. This is Harry and Meghan, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, operating fully on their own terms in a space where they're not constrained by rigid expectations or outdated protocols. They're connecting directly with communities, highlighting causes that actually matter to them, and doing it in a way that feels intentional rather than ceremonial. There's a difference between showing up because it's on a schedule and showing up because you actually care, and people can tell the difference instantly. That's why these visits land the way they do. It's not about titles, it's about impact. And when that impact starts being felt from the very first day, you're not looking at just another tour. You're looking at something that shifts perception in real time. And maybe the most telling part is how quickly the narrative starts scrambling to catch up once reality refuses to cooperate. Because when day one is already being described by those present as warm, engaging, and successful, it becomes a lot harder to sell the idea that they're somehow irrelevant or unwelcome. That disconnect becomes impossible to ignore. The more moments like this stack up, the clearer the picture gets. This isn't a couple fading into the background. This is a couple redefining what public engagement looks like in a modern context. And if day one is anything to go by, this Australia visit isn't just another stop on a calendar. It's a reminder that when Harry and Meghan step into a space, they don't just attend, they leave a mark. So when you see reactions to this clip, when you see the pushback, the attempts to downplay it or dismiss it, understand what's really happening. It's not just about disagreement, it's about control. Control over the story, control over perception, control over how events are interpreted and understood. And every time that control slips, even slightly, moments like this slip through. Moments where someone simply says, "This is what I see," and suddenly the entire conversation shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough to make people pause, enough to make people reconsider, enough to remind everyone that there's always more than one way to look at a situation, no matter how settled the narrative might seem. And right now, as Harry and Meghan continue to move forward with their lives, building something that exists outside of that traditional structure, those moments are becoming more and more significant because they show that the story isn't fixed, it's still being written, and not everyone is sticking to the script.